Okay, great. Well, thanks very much. Well done, everybody. Fascinating set of analyses. I was particularly interested in the Uganda research around networks and impact or lack of impact. Really, really interesting stuff on the ground. I don't want to monopolise the conversation by all means, and hopefully you've got lots of questions over the next 20 minutes or so, I guess, before we wrap up. But maybe just one that sort of connects perhaps some of the themes. And I should say, instantly, apologies, Margaret, for your delays arriving. I fear since the Brexit vote, Britain's becoming a bit of a neglected tropical nation itself, or non-tropical nation. But there's been interesting. I mean, there's been a lot of focus on the pipeline and the research and the R&D for new products. But I really wonder whether a lot of the lessons coming out of a number of these sort of research areas you've been looking at is about the neglect of new models of distribution. You know, we're so focused on the sort of pipeline and the drug, and perhaps a diversification of drugs, to some degree the diagnostics, but not nearly enough. But, what about that endpoint, and the tensions between a single vertical donation-based program versus integration into the health systems, or indeed tapping into innovative new models using even the pharma companies, let alone other companies and other organizations with greater expertise around the practical issues of distribution and incentives and accountability down to the level of individual patient or individual at risk. So I wonder who might like to come in on that and whether that's a neglected area that we need a lot more focus on. Anyone like to kick off?
Okay, so I think coming from an organization that has been primarily focused on R&D, I think what you just mentioned is exactly where the community needs to focus. It's this distribution, supply, all the mechanisms that are going to really foster this supply aspect. I think what was interesting to me also in the latest talks that we just heard, it's how we should be thinking about partnerships with those domains in a much broader way, integrating far more the communities. And this has been, I think this is a gap that to me is a lesson, and this is something that I'm going to take back home actually, because that's a way of saying, okay, when it comes to development, when it comes to research, we need to onboard, of course, the local communities to understand what are the gaps, what are the needs, and how we can harvest from their knowledge. But when it comes also to implementation, the access aspect, I think this has been really an aspect that has been neglected, and it needs to be absorbed.
Thank you. I would, just following on from that actually, what Margaret was talking about with the sort of moving on from the babysitting models, I think is one of the most important things, and it's ownership within the community. And I have been working in these communities for a long time, and just actually after an ISNTD meeting in November about water, sanitation and hygiene, the Acting for Health community, I don't know if you know it, and Cameron and Alex Dower came out to Uganda and did an interactive acting sort of 5-day workshop with some people, and really got them thinking about the community's role in reducing transmission of these diseases. And it was only on a very small scale, it was sort of a pilot project, but it was hugely successful, and they were really engaged with the problem, but also then that made them think about how they can sort of lobby their local district to say we want more pitlatrines, or we want the drugs to be left behind, and aspects such as that. So I think trying to really sort of improve that community engagement and get them ownership of the problem, but also get them to demand the drugs, for example, or to demand infrastructure support for building pitlatrines. And I think that's the way forwards, because I mean, I personally also think this is all about drugs, and tomorrow's about diagnostics, but I do think that drugs are not the answer alone, particularly for schistosomiasis, because it amplifies outside of the human host as well, so it's a bit different to most of the other NTDs. But I do think that there is a lot to be said for moving towards that community ownership.
Yeah, just like I said earlier, there is a strong need to have a community perspective towards issues around access. So the R&D, the companies can do all the researches and innovation. At the end of the day, when it gets to the recipient communities, you begin to have critical issues on how the patients can have real access, and the critical areas that we have, the barriers would include wanting to more like superimpose knowledge, that we have from other practices or other experiences into different communities. I think we should begin to look at what are the models that would work, what are the models that are culturally, that would culturally resonate. There is this project on I think it was called the BEAT project in Afghanistan for vaccines, how they used the cultural understanding of beads that they wear around the arm, or for vaccines to ensure that children get their vaccines. So we have to have culturally acceptable kinds of distribution, kinds of access that would work. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So there is also the need for us to have an integrative way of thinking. So it's not just about pharma. There is a Microsoft that could say, I could do apps. There is another, so companies can come together and see how they could work when driving issues around access.
I could say numerous things, but I'm going to limit it to one key point. I think we need to be transparent in what do we expect from the local countries and the communities, because how can we start integrating into health systems when we haven't made clear what our expectations are? Perhaps at the country level, it's looking at how can we verify if an individual is treated, and at an individual level, trying to understand what they actually expect out of health systems. I mean, they expect to go to the health system and get vaccinated. They don't expect to go to the local health center and get preventive chemotherapies.
Andrew, you've given me another opportunity to plug the 2018 index. So the idea of supply to countries which might not be commercially attractive, so either rural communities or the least developed countries. There's also a gap in the analysis in previous indices. We've added a new indicator for 2018, which looks at the extent to which companies are really doing demand forecasting in less commercially attractive markets, and what companies are engaged in to enable distribution within those markets. So we'll be able to say more later in the year.
I want to build on an earlier remark. I'm thinking of malaria. There's no question in my mind that you need both better diagnosis, better treatments, but also better vector control. And we have very ample evidence that suggests that when all three of these are coupled together, that we get better outcomes in terms of reduced burden of disease and more patients have a reduced burden of disease. One of the things that I'm struck by is the old notion of a power versus precision. I think of myself thinking about reducing interest rates, for example, and then the question will be, well, who will actually go to the bank and say, I want a new bond for my house? So some of the work that you heard described up here is going to answer that question. Who should go? Who do you hope that the policy would serve? And then the question that I might try to answer is, well, who should be doing that reduction in the interest rate? How much should it be, and so on? And I think there are two different questions, and we need to answer both to do a better job of using our resources. And the final comment I would make that never came up here, I wish we were moving in a different direction globally, that the high-income countries cared more about neglected tropical diseases and more resources were going in that direction. My take is that that's not the case, and there's both objective data and hunch about things like Brexit, things like the election of Donald Trump, and so on. I think we're becoming more isolationist, and I think we'll have to be better stewards of the resources that we commit to NTDs, and the kinds of things that we're describing up here of measuring impact, I think will become more important for us to secure long-term investment in these very important diseases.
I think just to comment a bit on the example of Chagas I was developing earlier, the network of patients of Chagas is a very active one today. They're set up as a federation. They mobilize themselves, they go to the WHA, they found means to resource themselves, and they have become really social activists. We've bridged a bit some contacts with the HIV patients community, and there was a lot of exchange, which was quite interesting as a model of thinking. Another point about your question, integration, obviously, and I think that has to come, particularly in the case of Chagas, through public leadership. And you need, the countries, Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, the one who are really ahead, sadly, in the endemicity, to take a lead in setting the priorities, putting the monies as well, in finding solutions not only to access, but also to the R&D agenda. That still, I think, is still a big gap missing. Yeah.
Okay, let's open it up. Sorry, yeah, no one come back? No, that's good. Yeah, just past the, yeah.
I think something else we didn't talk about in the area of distribution is the issue of stockout. And in my past life, I knew that while we're working on projects, you have great initiatives and you're running these access, and all of a sudden, the companies aren't able to supply, and I mean all the companies involved in the project, and so they are the patients, and suddenly they don't have medicines. How just to put the thoughts out there.
Just to add to that, actually, there's obviously tomorrow is the Diagnostics Day, and as diagnostics improve, the proportion of the people we know to be infected will also increase, and that's having a huge impact on the demand, for not necessarily the demand from the community, but sort of, WHO guidelines are often based on prevalence of infection, and so obviously if there are, suddenly the prevalence rockets for what we think it is, then that has a huge impact as well for the supply of drugs.
Let's open it up. Let's got a question at the front.
Yep.
Oh, thank you. So thank you all for an excellent panel. I have a specific question for Eric. I'm very glad to see Chagas represented in this group of serious problems. So one of the issues that we've been facing in Brazil with the reemergence of Chagas is that the population that are getting reinfected or infected as the new acute cases really are in very remote areas along the Amazon River, along the Tocantins River. And I wanted to have your impression as how are we going to deal with the distribution? Two things really. First, the diagnosis of these people, because some of them are 4 to 5 hours away from a hospital or from a clinic, and how are we going to get medicines to these people? And the other question, Eric, is in terms of the biomarkers for treatment response, which I think is a key thing, what is your vision as to where we should go with that? And I also have a curiosity to Poppy. Why is that the children that are below average, school average, don't get the treatment? Is it because of the side effects, or is it because of the formulation isn't right? I was just curious to know about that. Thank you.
So Merck are currently developing a pediatric formulation. So it is commonly known to be safe in children, but it has never been truly clinically tested in children. So WHO will not produce those guidelines to say that. But people do know that, obviously.
Okay. All right.
But yes.
Got it.
Okay. There's been, as you know, some experiences in Brazil made around collaboration with the malaria control program to outreach. It's still under, the results are still, being looked at, but it could be a way to respond to the most isolated groups of patients. And we've seen a great deal of willingness to engage from other control programs rather than going in silos. The problem remains very much around the biomarkers and the lack of a test of cure. I mean, that's one of the big problems of the problem of Chagas. We feel that from the, I'll talk here with my access hat on Chagas, that there's a need to be maybe more courageous in engaging with access to treatment, because it's always been a bit of a chicken and the egg question, and and as long as we don't have a test of cure, we still have sufficient evidence today around biomarkers, PCRs, methodologies to indicate the progress of treatment sufficient to engage in treating, because that's been a bit a problem, in Brazil, but in Argentina, in the big countries, not to do much until we got the perfect equation. So let's see a bit and analyze a bit further what comes out from the collaboration with the malaria control program, but it seems quite promising.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll just have to state your name. We'll go with you first.
Mark Gardner, Salmentis. I wanted to congratulate Jeffery on bringing forward the idea of the priority review voucher and encouraging the carrot of encouraging people to do the right thing for economic reasons, I guess. I was just wondering, what did you think, this far down the road, of the impact of that, and has it meant that people have been doing something very different, and to what extent have they been doing that differently? And if the answer, and also, for other people as well, whether you would tweak anything about the program, perhaps apart from, I know you mentioned that you thought that too many of these had been awarded for the wrong things in rare pediatric diseases.
I like to remind audiences that the Orphan Drug Act is often looked at as being something that was terribly successful. Less than 300,000 patients, there would be an incentive, which would be market exclusivity for 7 years. It took 10 years for the ODA to figure out what similarity meant, meaning if another drug was introduced, was it the same or different from the one that had been given market exclusivity? So we're at about the 10-year point. About 20 vouchers have been awarded, the majority of those for the pediatric indication. David and Henry and I wish that pediatric indication wasn't there. This is a gross statement, and by that I mean it's imprecise. If you have 400 or more patients, and we use some averages in terms of the cost and the benefit, you probably don't need a priority review voucher to stimulate that investment. There are enough patients to recoup it. So I would argue that roughly half of those vouchers are unnecessary, and there's some work that's been done to confirm that. But that's neither here nor there. We have it. I think it'll never go away, and here's the reason. If you had a child who had a rare pediatric disorder, or you worried that your child might, and you walk into a congressman or senator's office and say, let me see if I've got this right, you're taking away an incentive that might find the cure for my daughter, my son, it'll never go away. So we're going to have to live with it, and we shall. It means the prices, the value of it will go down. We are now extending the idea of vouchers into vector control. We introduced a paper last year. If the EPA wasn't so dysfunctional, we might, it's very popular with both Republicans and Democrats. I think we can be successful. And the same idea has been extended to the patent office to get expedited review and patents. So I think the notion is a good one, but these things take time. And in the meantime, we'll do a better job with access. You've heard my remarks. I don't think it's a regulatory fix. I think it's a market fix. But I think the concept is a good one. And I'm delighted that we came to it when we did, and I think the next 10 years will be even more promising. There will be another award this year. There will be another neglected tropical disease voucher awarded, is what we expect in malaria. That one will be a little more problematic. It'll sound like the vaccine story because of some efficacy issues. But we're getting better. We're getting better, so I'm optimistic.
Ian Bolton again. Primarily addressing this to Danny around your comment that you're introducing demand forecasting as a way of a new component of your access to medicines index. Shall I call it a conventional first world market, the pharmaceutical companies can generate demand because they have sales forces and they have other ways of generating demand from the medical profession, which then feeds into their demand forecasting. In these situations, the pharmaceutical companies are not out there generating demand. They are responding to demand that is given to them by whoever is procuring the products or getting the products from them. And I know that this worries, for example, the Global Fund around the uptake of novel interventions as well, is what are the mechanisms that can be properly used to generate demand and to, in a way that gets access as fast as possible, either for new interventions or the sort of things we're taking. And it does seem to me that it's a trifle unfair, if I understood what you were saying, to put the emphasis on the pharmaceutical companies to say, do demand forecasting, when they're not actually doing anything to generate the demand themselves. The onus for that is on what the rest of the what you and the rest of the panel have been talking about, and the people who do that.
Yeah, I can respond to that. I think it's a matter of the scope of the Access to Medicine Index and what we look at. So it's not only medicines and products that are procured through mechanisms such as the Global Fund, it's much broader than that. So it's also cases where the companies will be responding to the private market or the public market for specific medicines outside of large procurement practices. We had an interesting conversation at the, we have a biannual expert review committee that informs the methodology for the subsequent index. And the nature of that conversation was much more around, well, whose responsibility is it to do the demand forecasting? Is it the government such that it informs the tender which the company responds to? And I think the consensus view in this case was that there is certainly a role for the company to support more accurate demand forecasting, and that they have the capacity and the experience to do so, particularly where the capacity on the government might be more constrained. But in terms of the larger procurement practices, yeah, take your point, and it wouldn't be relevant in those cases.
The other remark I would make is if you look at the Clinton Health Initiative, which tried to aggregate demand and forecast it for anti-malarials, the benefit is not to put the onus on the pharma company to say you should stimulate demand. The benefit is to understand what the demand is, then aggregate it, take advantage of economies of scale to secure the supply chain so that it's going to be available and it's going to be there, and then the kinds of things that Danny's group is looking at, is it registered in the right countries, and so on and so on. So I would just argue that the point of a demand forecast is not necessarily to somehow expect, or it doesn't assume that I'm responsible for that demand. I'm just trying to understand what it is so that we can aggregate it and take advantage of some economies of scale to stabilize the supply market. This is certainly true in vector control. Winning the bid the first year and then not winning the second, I can't keep a manufacturing plant open with that kind of episode going up and down. So what I'm looking for is a stable market.
Actually, to your point of who's responsible for creating the demand, that's exactly the type of question that we are asking ourselves within the pediatric praziquantel consortium right now. Because pretty much when I was saying that the key issue now is procurement, that's really that. It's about, and we've been discussing with a number of organizations that are suppliers, right? That are organizations that are procuring commodities to governments. And the answer is very much that one, which is we're very interested by your product. It addresses a key need because, to your question, it's actually not in the guidelines of WHO. We cannot treat preschool-aged children with praziquantel the way it is now because it's a huge pill that is bitter, etc. So we have to come up with a new formulation. So it is a scientific and medical need, but please, we will do so if there's a demand. So it is that mechanism that, who is responsible here to create the demand? So we have to now come up with an advocacy program also to local governments to say, listen, this formulation is going to come. It's going to address a serious need in your country. and we need to prioritize the countries where we are going to have to come up with this formulation. And we will need to support you and help you to create that forecast in a way, or at least to understand, even getting a better understanding of the prevalence, the amount that you are going to be needing in a way. So it is, it's an uncharted territory here again. We don't know who is really responsible, but I think we have just to support each other to make sure that at the end the patients are treated, right?
I think pharma companies are beginning to recognize this and are beginning to put teams together that address this issue of access and ensuring that there is some level of demand forecast by engaging governments and letting them know that these are priorities and putting some kind of not full surety or stability, but a sense of what it would look like in like 3 years and all. So they're beginning to put teams together that address those issues.
Okay, maybe time for one more if there is. If not, I think we should thank all our panelists and head into the informal panel.